Welcome to Drive the Daf. Clear, structured explanation of the daily Daf in 20 minutes. You can even follow in the car.
Pesachim Daf discusses more activities which one might do with grains and whether or not it'll make the grains chametz. We'll discuss scalding the grains in water. We'll discuss toasting the grain. We'll discuss soaking the grain in water in order to be able to get the shells off. Towards the end of the Daf, we'll have another Mishnah which will talk about using the flour and what you can do with the flour, what mixtures you can put it into. So first of all, the Gemara is discussing boiling grain, scalding it in boiling water. So the Gemara says that Rav Yosef says you can scald the grain, but you shouldn't do 2 kernels at a time, 2 kernels of wheat at least, because one may get stuck in the crack of the other one, and then it'll prevent the scalding water from getting into the crack. If it's not hit by the boiling water, it'll become chametz. It's the boiling of the water that keeps it from becoming chametz. When it's scalding, if you have 2 together, it'll possibly be problematic. Therefore, you should only do 1 kernel at a time. Now, Abaye says if you're going to toast or singe your grain, so you shouldn't do 2 stalks together, because maybe some liquid will seep out of one stalk when you're exposing it to heat, and it'll drip onto the other stalk and make the other stalk to be chametz. That liquid brings chametz. So Rava disagreed with that, and Abaye himself also later changed, but they contradicted this for different reasons. Rava said it's not a problem because the liquid that comes out is fruit juice. It's juice of a grain, and fruit juice doesn't make chametz. Abaye disagreed with it for a different reason. He said no, what actually happens is that it drips off, it runs down, and therefore it's not a problem. Now, Rava's proof that Abaye must be wrong is that if you can't put 2 stalks together because you're afraid of liquid dripping from one to the other, you would also not be allowed to put even 1 stalk to roast because it could drip from the kernels on one end to the kernels on the other end. Must be that you are allowed to. Abaye brought a different case. Abaye said if you have a kli, a jug, which you use to toast grain during the year, and you want to use it on Pesach, you're allowed to as long as it's used face down so that the water can run out and drip down. Water that's dripping down is not going to make chametz. It runs off. It doesn't stick to the grain. It doesn't stick to the kli. If, however, it's right side up, then it's problematic. Now, Rava disagrees with that, and he says, no, the problem here is not the dripping down. The heter is not the dripping down. The heter is because it's fruit juice, and therefore you're allowed to even have it facing up. Okay, now the Gemara goes into the sugya of soaking grain. Now, grain was important to soak before it was ground because the shells form bran, and that makes the flour very coarse. If you could peel off those shells before you actually grind them, then you get pure, clean, white flour, which is what we call silas, fine flour, and it makes white bread. Now, the Gemara is going to discuss the soaking of barley and then soaking of wheat. The Gemara is not sure which one is more chomer. The Gemara notes that wheat is harder, but barley is smoother, and therefore harder is more likely to keep the water out from penetrating the kernel and causing chametz. On the other hand, being smoother also keeps the water out. So the Gemara will discuss which one. So let's begin with barley. So the Gemara quotes a brisa. The brisa says you're not allowed to soak barley on Pesach because it may become chametz. Now, if you did soak it, what is the halacha then? So there's a number of opinions here. So the Tanna Kama says if it begins to crack, that shows that it is swelling. That means water got in, and then it's aser. Rav Yossi says if you see it starting to swell, you can soak it in vinegar, and then it'll become mutter. Now Amiroim. So Shmuel says the halacha is not like Rav Yossi. You can't just soak it in vinegar. Rav Chizah says the name of Mar Ukva, when we say that it's cracking, we don't mean that it's actually showing cracks now. We just mean that if you would put it on a barrel of wine, it would absorb the fumes from the wine, and that would make it crack. And Shmuel disagreed with that. Shmuel said, no, when we say that it's cracking, we mean that it's actually cracking now. If it's less than that, if you could tell that if you would put it on wine, it would crack, that's not a problem. And Shmuel actually did a story like that in a place of a man named Bar Choshu. He was matir kernels which would crack. Now, Rabba says that a bal nefesh, somebody who's careful with himself, should not soak the grain. The Gemara says, what do you mean? We just said the Brisa said that it's forbidden to soak the grain. What are you telling me that it's an extra stringent thing for a bal nefesh? So Gemara answers, now we're discussing wheat. The difference here is we're not talking about barley anymore, now we're talking about wheat. Wheat is harder, and therefore, according to this version, this understanding, wheat is not aser, but wheat is just something that a Baal Nefesh should not do. Now, other Amoram expressed their opinion as to whether or not you're allowed to soak wheat. We just saw that Rabbah says you're not allowed, that a Baal Nefesh shouldn't soak wheat. Says the Gemara that Rav Nachum said anybody who listens to Rabbah, who he called Abba, out of respect, anybody who listens to him will end up eating coarse, dry, disgusting bread because you can't soak your wheat. But other people hold that you could soak your wheat. Rav Huna soaked wheat in his house. Rava Bar Avin soaked wheat in his house. Now what does Rava say? So Rava had 3 different stages in his shita in soaking the wheat. So Rava first said that it's aser. You're not allowed to soak the wheat. The Gemara says, hold on a second, but our Brisa only said that it's also to soak barley. That implies you're allowed to soak wheat. Obviously, the Gemara over there is assuming that wheat is less problematic. The Gemara, as we said before, the Gemara says, no, actually, it could be that wheat is more problematic, because even though wheat is harder, but it's also cracked. It's not smooth surface. So this Mishnah is telling you this Brisa is telling you you're not allowed to soak even barley, which has a smooth surface. Certainly you're not allowed to soak wheat, which has a cracked surface, and the water can get in more easily. Okay, that was Rava's first approach. Rava's second, he later changed and he said, no, you're allowed to soak wheat. And my proof is that there's a Brisa that shows that there's such a thing as clean white bread, which refers to matzah on Pesach, and the only way to get white matzah is if you soaked it. Now, what's the brisa? The brisa is you're allowed to use on Pesach bread, which the Gemara means matzah, whether it is white clean or it is rough, coarse bread, coarse matzah. So you see that there is such a thing as clean white bread, clean white matzah. And obviously that can only be made by soaking it, and therefore it is permitted to soak the wheat. So Gemara says, Rav Papa asked, Rabbi said, I will prove to you, and he had 2 sources. He said, I'll prove to you that it is possible to make clean white matzah without soaking it. What's my proof? First of all, I have a brisa that says as follows. It says that fine flour and coarse flour that you buy from a goy. So what's its halacha? Is it tamei or tahar? So it depends. If it's from the villages, then it's assumed to be tahar, and if it's from the cities, then it's assumed to be tamei. So Gemara says, what's the pshat? Why is there a difference between the villages and the cities? The difference is whether they soak it or not. The villages, they didn't soak the flour, and therefore it was rough flour, therefore it's tahar because it never got wet. Something which is never became wet is never huchshar to be a mekabel toma, and therefore it's tahar. However, in the cities they do soak it, so therefore it's tamei. So Gemara says, so you see that in the villages they didn't soak the flour, and yet it says both the clean flour and the rough flour are usable from the guy. The only difference is whether it's tahar or tamei. But the villages that don't wash their grain, that don't soak the grain, are able to produce clean white flour. So Gemara says, Rav will answer, you will say, no, that's not what the Mishnah means. The Mishnah means the 2 options line up. You have clean flour and rough flour that comes from the villages or from the cities. The rough flour comes from the villages, the clean flour comes from the cities, because in the villages they do not soak it and they end up with a rough flour, and you can't make fine flour or fine white matzah out of that. In the cities they do soak it, and therefore they're able to get cleaner flour. So Rava left the Beis Medrash, and afterwards Rav Papa said, in one second I have another source, and that's from the Korban Mincha, because the flour that's used in a Korban Mincha is called silas, it's called fine flour, and yet the halacha is you're not allowed to soak it. So you see clearly that not soaked grain could still produce fine, clean, white flour. Okay, now Rava then changed again, and Rava's third opinion is not only are you allowed to soak your flour, it's actually mitzvah to soak your flour. It's the proper way of making matzah is to soak the wheat in water first. How do you know that? Because it says Ushmartem es ha-mitzvos, which we read Ushmartem es ha-matzos, that you got to be protecting and guarding your matzah from becoming chametz. Now, how are you supposed to protect the matzah from becoming chametz if it never touches water? So what stage of the matzah production are we referring to? If we're referring to after the baking is done, well, that can't become chametz then. It's baked already. We saw halacha earlier that it can never become chametz. So it's got to be referring to where the grains became wet. So Gemara says, how do you know? Maybe it's referring to the dough. You're supposed to guard the dough once it's ground into flour. So Gemara says, Rava says, I'll prove to you that guarding the dough is not called guarding. That's not enough. How do you know? Because there's a Mishnah that says, let's say you buy a dough from a guy, and you can tell that it's not chametz. You know how to analyze the dough. You know it's not chametz. So the halacha is you're allowed to take this dough, bake it into matzah. You can eat it on Pesach, but you're not yotze the mitzvah of matzah with it. You got to take real matzah in order to be yotze the mitzvah. Why? Because real matzah requires shmira, has to be guarded from becoming chametz l'shem mitzvahs matzah. In order to be able to be used for the mitzvah, it has to be guarded l'shma. This thing, you got it in the dough stage, means you never did the guarding. Says Rava, obviously guarding it in the dough stage is not enough. You got to guard it before the dough stage. That means that there's some other stage which it could become chametz where you're responsible to guard it. That must be that you're soaking the grain. That's the only way that you could be mekayim the mitzvah of guarding it from becoming chametz, l'shem mitzvah. Says Gemara, not necessarily. Maybe what it just means is that you're supposed to guard it the entire time that the dough is there. You bought it, it was already dough. That means part of the time of the dough's existence, it wasn't being guarded. You got to guard the dough for its entire life, from when the water hits the flour and the dough begins until the baking. Maybe that's what it means. I don't necessarily accept this proof. Says the Gemara, Rava did not back down, and Rava still held that there was a mitzvah to soak the grain and guard it from becoming chametz. And the Gemara says we could see that because Rava told the people who harvest the wheat, be careful, make sure you harvested l'shem matzas mitzvah, make sure that you protect it from becoming wet, and do that l'shem matzas mitzvah. You see, he still held his opinion. Says the Gemara, Mar Beit Ravina's mother, whenever she harvested grain, she put it in a separate kli if it was going to be used for matzah, so that it would be protected from becoming chametz. Okay, now the Gemara moves on to the subject of what happens when you have grain which is actually chametz. It looks like regular grain. You can't tell that it's chametz. So what are you supposed to do with it? So the Gemara says it was an incident that happened. It was a ship filled with wheat, and it sunk. The ship sunk. They were able to salvage some of the grain from the bottom of the river that the ship was in. However, the river was called Chishta. However, that grain was all wet and it was assumed to be chametz. So what are you supposed to do with it? So the Gemara says that Rava said, sell it to a guy. So Rabbi Bar Levi said, I'll prove to you that you're not allowed to sell to a guy because we're afraid the guy will sell it to a Jew afterwards and he will not realize that it's chametz. What's the proof? When you have a piece of clothing, a blanket or something, a cloth, that has shatness in it, and you can't tell, you can't find it. So it's a similar scenario. It's usher to use it, but you won't be able to tell. So the halacha there is you're not allowed to sell it to a guy, and you're not allowed to use it for your animal. The only thing you could do with it is make shrouds for the dead. So why not to sell it to the guy? Obviously, because the guy will resell it to a Jew. So you shouldn't be allowed to sell this chametz kernels to a guy either. He might resell it to a Jew. Now, it was right before Pesach, and that's why there was concern here. So Rava said, you're right, except it's psak. Therefore, I'm changing. I'm saying the only thing you could do with this chametz is sell it to a Jew, one kav at a time, in a small amount that you know he'll be able to finish before Pesach itself. It won't be hanging around. Okay. Next topic is using flour to thicken a pot of soup or something liquidy. Are you allowed to put flour in there to thicken it up? So Gemara says, the Brisa says you're not allowed to, but you could if you put in vinegar. So machlokes, whether the vinegar has to be in there before the flour or the vinegar could go in after the flour. What's the function of the vinegar? It helps it cook faster, and therefore it interrupts the fermentation process of the flour that's hitting the water. Says the Gemara, who's this opinion that holds that you're allowed to put the vinegar in first and it'll still speed up the cooking of the flour when it gets there, and we're not afraid that the vinegar will be dissipated by the time you add the flour? Gemara says this is Rabbi Huda's opinion, because you see similarly that he holds that vinegar or brine in a pot speeds up the cooking even after a while. We see that from his opinion in Hilchos Shabbos. Hilchos Shabbos, you're not allowed to add spices to a boiling pot because you're going to cook the spices. Says the Gemara, you're allowed to if it is cooled or if it's a klisheni. The Gemara says unless it has vinegar or brine in it, which will speed up the cooking process. And Rabbi Huda says even if the vinegar or brine is in there before you add the spices, it'll still speed up the cooking process. So there you see that Rabbi Huda holds even if the vinegar or the brine is in there before something, the vinegar is not dissipated and still speeds it up. Here also the vinegar, the brine, could be in the pot before you add the flour, and it'll still speed up the cooking to the extent that you will not make it chametz. The Gemara says, why do you have to say it's Rabbi Yehuda? Rabbi Yossi could also be the one that says you're allowed to put vinegar in there. We saw Rabbi Yossi earlier. Rabbi Yossi says that if you have grain that was soaked in water and it started to swell, so you soak it in vinegar and it'll arrest the swelling, it'll contract it. So Gemara says, no. That's where it's straight vinegar. This is vinegar in a mixture. You don't see that everybody says a vinegar in a mixture put into a pot of soup does not dissipate. It could be that he definitely agrees that dissipates very well. It says the Gemara, Ula says, halach l'mais, you should not put flour in a pot with vinegar before. After vinegar, nothing to do. Don't rely on vinegar. Avoid problems like we tell a Nazir, listen, you want to walk through the vineyard, it's going to make you taivas to eat grapes, to drink wine, better avoid the vineyard altogether, stay away from Yisur. Now the Gemara talks about adding toasted flour to a pot. The Gemara says that Rav Papi told the bakers in the house of the Reish Galusa that it's permitted, and Rava got involved. Two versions to what he did. One version is that he said you can't do it in the house of the Reish Galusa because there are too many servants there who aren't careful, they're not responsible. According to a different version, Rava himself put the flour in so that he could be careful with it. That ends the Gemara. Now we get to the next Mishnah, which discusses a number of things that you can do with flour or you cannot do with flour. The Mishnah discusses putting flour into charosis or mustard. Now, charosis contains vinegar, and mustard is very sharp in its own right. Does it prevent the chimutz, the fermentation of the flour? So the Mishnah says you should not do it. If you did, so the Tanakama Chachamim say you have to eat it right away, and that's all right. Rabbi Meir says, no, don't eat it. You have to burn it. You don't know how fast it becomes chametz. Now, the Mishnah interestingly inserts a halacha here about preparing the carbon Pesach itself. We're trying to explain how it fits in here. But the Mishnah says you should not cook the carbon Pesach, not in any type of liquid, not in fruit juice, not in anything like that. The Torah says that it has to be roasted. Cooking is not allowed, and that's why you're not allowed to. And the Mishnah is adding even fruit juice. But you are allowed to baste the roasting meat. You're allowed to smear it with juice or liquid, and you're also allowed to dip it into juice or liquid when you are eating it. Okay, back to the chametz. When the baker works with his bread, the dough, he has a pot of water with him that he dips his hand into. That water contains chametz. You gotta pour it out. You cannot use it. Okay, now we saw in the Mishnah that you shouldn't put flour into charosis containing vinegar or into mustard. And then we saw that there's a machlokes, what are you allowed to do with it? What case is a machlokes going on? Was it going back to the last case, which is the mustard, and that's where there's a machlokes, and the chachamim say that you're allowed to eat it? Or is it even in the charosis, which contains vinegar, they would also say you're allowed to eat it? So if Kahana says the machlokes is only by chardal, only by mustard, the charosis containing vinegar, the chachamim would not argue, they would say you're not allowed to eat it. The Gemara brings a brisa that seems to say exactly that. The chachamim are only arguing in the case of mustard, but they agree that charosis that you put flour into, you're not allowed to eat. Now, the Gemara is going to show otherwise. Rav Huna ben Rav Yehuda says in the name of Rav Nachman, in the name of Shmuel, the halacha is like the chachamim. Nachman Yitzchak asked him, it was like the chachamim in what case? Case of mustard? Or were they also arguing in the case of vinegar, and the halacha is like them in the case of vinegar? And he says, yes, they're also arguing in the vinegar, in the charosis which contains vinegar, and the halacha is like them there also. Says the Gemara, that's therefore machlokes between Rav Kahana and Shmuel as to whether or not the chachamim argue in the case of the vinegar. And says the Gemara, Rav Ashi says that it's logical that Rav Kahana is right, and that they will argue and they would not allow. It's logical that Rav Kahana is right, and they argue only in the case of mustard, but the case of vinegar they would not allow. The case of the flour put into charosis which contains vinegar, they would not allow it. The proof is from the fact that we say that the halacha is not like Rabbi Yossi. All the way back at the beginning of the daf, Rabbi Yossi said that if you have swelled up grain, you put it in vinegar, it'll arrest the process. So we don't hold like Rabbi Yossi. Why not? Obviously, vinegar doesn't solve the problem. If vinegar doesn't solve the problem, then it's logical that the chachamim over here would agree that putting it into charosis containing vinegar would not solve the problem. Versus no, not necessarily. Over there, it's just saying it's not going to solve the problem of swelling. It's not going to cause it to shrink. However, it could be that it does stop the chametz, the fermentation process, even though we don't paskin like Rabbi Yossi, that's because we want it to shrink. But that'll stop the chimutz that we do agree will happen, and the chachamim therefore would say that you're allowed to put it into vinegar, which is in the charosis and the halacha.
Drive the Daf is a project of the Grand Woodlands Shul and is presented by Rabbi Yitzchak Landa. Find us on YouTube or subscribe to daily emails by emailing drivethedaf@gmail.com.